Hello, fellow duelists. We are going to be talking about some myths and legends and the straight up facts between modern and classic Yu-Gi-Oh! I get really sick and tired of watching videos and seeing people talk about old school unfair strategies, and we're going to be talking about those unfair old school strategies and explaining why those unfair strategies weren't as unfair as what people remember, because we're going to be explaining the differences between them and all of that. And of course, the first card we're going to be getting into is going to be Yata-Garasu, or better known as Yata-Lock. Now, there were, of course, other cards to Yata-Lock, but this was the main card. Now, if you think about Yata-Garasu compared to, I don't know, Telomermans, the difference is one's part of an archetype and one's not. Look, it's part of an archetype. Now you may thinking, oh, but isn't Yata-Garasu part of this? No, it is not. Because it's a Fiend Spellcaster effect monster. And it has no other cards part of an archetype. Now it's part of a theme of monsters known as Spirit Monsters, but that'll be for a different video. Now another deck that people will say is unfair is Royal Magical Library, FTK and OTK. I think there were two variants. Again, Royal Magical Library. The deck is named after one card. If you did not see this one card during the entire game, guess what? Your Royal Magical Library deck fell apart faster than you could say I have lost. Let's let you compare it to, oh, wait a minute. Look, part of another archetype. Oh my god, another unfair deck. Part of this is an engine, and Royal Magical Library was part of engines and different ways that you could play Royal Magical Library. But the difference between this card and Royal Magical Library is it's not part of an archetype. Now, you're thinking, oh, but why is Jinzo on here? Isn't Jinzo part of an archetype? Yes, it is. Now, but not when it came out. So when Jinzo came out, it was a very powerful card, but you could easily kill it with your spell cards. It had protection, but not protection from everything. Now, the only truly unfair monster, these two strategies you have to get really lucky with, and they're very gimmicky, and they don't work as good as people think they do. Now, the true unfair on strategy out of all of these cards is when Chaos Emperor Dragon had its original effect, and it wasn't once per turn. Also, it wasn't a hard once per turn. So, this card burns your opponent for 1,000 life points for every single card in both players' hands and field, and then inflicts an additional 300 points of damage as well. This was probably, in my opinion, the only unfair strategy in all of Classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Besides Magical Scientists. Those were the only extremely two unfair decks that had a higher win rate, but again, it's not really part of an archetype, so you had to get lucky in your very specific cards that you would have to get, unlike, say, Shaddolls. Now, the final thing we're going to be talking about before ending the video is Gravekeepers. Gravekeepers is probably the very first successful archetype that has spell cards and monster cards, and we'll go into more depth at why people didn't play pure Gravekeepers back in the day and why pure Gravekeepers wasn't good. We'll talk about that soon. I really want to, because I get sick and tired of people saying that this was the bomb diggity, that you had to play this to be good in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Not necessarily was it a good idea to play Gravekeepers, but it wasn't a necessity. And of course, our final talking point is that the only card that the strategies that I showed you that were unfair were not part of any archetype. Yeah, I guess you could say the Chaos Monsters, but they just called them the Chaos Monsters because of Chaos Emperor Dragon and Chaos Sorcerer, because Blackluster Soldier doesn't even have Chaos in his name. But the major difference I want to put between modern and classic Yu-Gi-Oh! is that modern unfairness is you have to be playing X archetype. The only thing you had to make sure if you say we're going up against Yada is to make sure you're playing at least a counter to Yada, which would have been very specific cards. But the problem with Yada, Garasu, and any of the Royal Magical Library decks were that they heavily relied on you drawing them. You couldn't really play any other strategy. Your whole deck had to be built around one card. Unlike these, where you can just kind of pick and choose what you put it in, where if I wanted to build a Chaos Emperor Dragon deck, I have to build the deck around Chaos Emperor Dragon. I have to make sure I have the right amount of light and darks. I couldn't just... Older decks don't play themselves. Yeah, you had a few, like maybe Royal Magical Library that kind of played itself, but not compared to these decks as a whole. That's all I have for right now. I'll be definitely making a better video, the myths and legends of classic and modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And their differences. Have a nice day.